Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our series on the Genesis Codex. Now we begin the real work of the Codex in setting up the recognitions that derive from universal law. This is our foundation for Triunnia. These are the things that we must know in order to build Triunnia effectively and avoid pitfalls and cliffs that would destroy the society if we weren't paying attention to them. There are 6 topics in this video: being, property of self, property of thought, thoughts and their exteriorizations, confusion, and insanity. Some of this knowledge is already known by people who found and run societies. Now we can take things to a much higher resolution and get a clearer picture on what is what, so this will be very detailed. There is much advanced knowledge in this video, and all videos in the series, so if it is over your head, that's okay. You'll get it eventually as you become more acquainted with the material. Stuff like this takes time to sink in and get effectively. Where your intuition may guide you, here we leverage that intuition and go into the details of how things work, because this gives us a better starting place to know what not to do as a society. With that, we will start the video. So previously, we were looking at the taxonomies of the Codex, which were maps of reality, and then we were looking at universal law, which are recognitions of the actual laws in the universe that are mostly based on those taxonomies. Now we're applying it. So these are recognitions, and these are not necessarily universal laws, but they stem from the universal laws. So it's like I guess it's called a principle. And so that's what these are, and there's a lot of them in the Codex. This is the bulk of the Codex. The next 50 pages or so, we're going to spend on this section. The Genesis Codex is really more about mapping out reality and recognitions than it is about setting law. We can, for now, assume these are guidelines and best practices rather than something that's enforceable. So this first recognition is about being. 1511, the composition. By virtue of 132, a triune self, and 1421b, ownership of parts. Aspects of being. Every listed part in ownership of parts is recognized as part of a triune self. So now we're establishing recognition over the thing. Officially, we noted it in universal law, and we saw it mapped out in a triune self, in the taxonomies. Now we're officially recognizing it. Okay, you have parts. We recognize that. And those parts make up the whole being of you. Exclusion of fakes. Anything claiming to be part of a triune self that is not listed in 132, a triune self, and 1421b, ownership of parts, is not considered part of a triune self. Dishonor of being. No thought is or can be considered part of a triune self. 1511b and 1511c are about, okay, we know what you are from 1511a. We also know what you're not. You are not your thoughts, and anything that's not recognized as being a part of you is not part of you. And that opens the door for if somebody says that something we know is not part of them is actually part of them, that's probably not true. That will guide policy away from corruptive decision making or corruptive patterns. So a couple explanatory notes here. Light of the triune self. The relation is the other way around with respect to a triune self and a thought. The relation is the other way around, and it is a relation of responsibility rather than composition. So a triune self is not composed of thoughts. Rather, a triune self is responsible for the thoughts that it issues. The thought contains light from the triune self given to it when it is issued. That light is recovered only when the thought is balanced. Intent. So 1511b and 1511c are meant to prevent errors in thinking that equate a thought with an actual part of one's being. That's the whole point. Thoughts are not a part of a triune self, nor are they an attribute of it. And here's some examples. Where this error is made include religions, pronouns, and identifying as. Whenever you say you identify as a thing, That thing is just a thought. It's not actually you, and it's not how identity works. Identity is just that abstract thing that separates your consciousness from all the other consciousnesses and is what makes you unique. But by itself, it has no attributes or anything like that. And so when you think of it, you don't actually tend to think of the identity part. You tend to think of your thought of the identity part. And that's an error, especially when you equate the two. It's a very subtle, very tricky error, but it is an error nevertheless. The same happens with pronouns, and the same happens with religions, among other things, and probably other things too. Parts are beings. Some parts of the Triune Self, including its senses, thoughts, and human body, are beings in their own right with their own consciousness. These beings are in your care and custody. They ought to be treated with peace, love, honor, and respect, and in exchange they will serve you well. Now, I made a slight error here. I said some parts of the Triune Self, including its thoughts. Thoughts are not a part of a Triune Self. They're more like data going through a process, but they're not data. So it's something else. They're beings in their own right. A clarification is needed here because a thought is not a part, and that was missed in writing this. The point about, okay, these are beings, be respectful, take care of them, take care of your body, take care of your senses, take care of the thoughts that are in you. If you run a scenario in your imagination that get it really good and there's beings in there, characters, how do you treat those characters? Are you respectful to them? Are you abusive to them in any way? And I'm saying imagination. What if that was a fantasy? Same question. Are you respectful? Are you abusive? Yeah, that actually matters. It matters and it scales because that's mental behavior. And as we saw in the free will universe, there's an entire universe of mental environments, and only one part of that's actually truly physical. It's all about training the mind to be able to act in the realm of permanence without causing harm to another. So, how you treat your own parts and your own thoughts and your own beings that are in your care matters a big deal. Growth. By virtue of one for one, the law of thought and its consequence, the eternal order of progression, every triune self is recognized as being in a continual state of growth. This is important because if that growth is harmed, stunted, prevented in any way, that's damaging to you and it's against the law. So it's against universal law to prevent you from growing. And if any state tries to do that, they run afoul of the law of thought and the law of free will, and that becomes a huge problem. If that goes on too far, it becomes a tyranny. The consciousness of the people gets so bound up in a knot and they can't grow out of it. And thus the tyranny is born. That's a tyranny of stagnation. And so it needs extra help to get out of there. And that usually involves destroying the system that created the tyranny in one way or another. The way we're doing it here is through obsolescence, not direct attack, because that won't work. 1521A, what to do and what not to do. As part of that growth are two sets of lessons that will be learned. What to do, defined in 1234C, which is the set of lessons concerned with what is right and in agreement with the rightness mind. And what not to do, 1234D, the set of lessons concerned with what is wrong and therefore not in alignment with the rightness mind. Do you see how these two phrases, right and wrong, what to do and what not to do, are both linked with the operation of the rightness mind? And that rightness mind is part of your being and it operates in a process. Everything about this codex is about keeping that process and your being and the entire system of you intact and free from corruption. That's extremely important for your health individually, it's important for your growth and evolution, and scaled up to a society, it's important for the society's development evolution as well. That's what makes for a peaceful society that everybody wants to be in. If you don't have that, you have what's effectively a try-hard civilization that's not doing very well. Building a knowledge set, which is part of growth. Each thought offers lessons for what to do and what not to do. A knowledge set is the set of all thoughts encountered by a triune self for which the lessons of what to do and what not to do were learned. So you got a sequence of thoughts that you've mastered, and that sequence together is a knowledge set. Or you have a bag of thoughts, and you've got a bag of knowledge. Or you've climbed a bunch of hikes, each one being a thought, and all together you've climbed a knowledge mountain. Pick your metaphor. Property of self. 1521. Property relations in, of, and for the triune self. So in universal law, we looked at ownership of self. Now we're going to establish property relations for all those ownership things. This is important because this sets up, we have a legally recognized property relation between this and that of each of the different parts of yourself. And that way, for every single property relation, we can then detect a trespass against it legally, and thus we can enforce that. Or we can maintain its integrity. We can also prevent things that currently occur and are allowed to occur that are actually damaging to the integrity of your being. That's why all this is done. So property relation with self. By virtue of 1421a, ownership of self, a property relation exists between the triune self and itself. That's called the identity relation. It's just you own yourself at the high level. Property relation with parts. By virtue of 1421b, ownership of parts, property relations exist between the triune self and each one of its parts. All of your minds are your property. Let's see if we can go to 1421b, actually. Right, so you own your knower, thinker, and doer. Therefore, your knower, thinker, and your doer are your property. You own your minds, I-ness, selfness, rightness, reason, feeling, desire, and objective mind. Therefore, your I-ness, selfness, reason, rightness, feeling, desire, and objective mind are your property. You own your faculties, light, I am, time, motive, image, dark, and focus. Therefore, your faculties, light, I am, time, motive, image, dark, and focus, are your property, and so forth. Your breath form is your property. Your body is your property. Your senses are your property. And your eye is your property because you own it too. And it's going to be the same for the processes and everything else. Property relation with processes. By virtue of 1421c, ownership of processes, property relations exist between the triune self and each of its processes. You own your thought process, you own your biological processes. Therefore, your thought process is also your property, and your biological processes are your property. Yeah, this is very explicit and detailed. We're not leaving anything to chance here. We're just going over it all and making sure there's no gaps or loopholes that somebody can take advantage of at some point in the future. This codex is designed to set a society up to last thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years. It's much more thorough and stable than anything that's come before. So we're going to set it up to have a very strong, solid foundation where everyone is aware of the fundamentals. Property relation with exteriorizations. By virtue of 1421d, ownership of exteriorizations, property relations exist between the triune self and each of its exteriorizations and their particulars. You own your time, therefore your time is your property. You own your condition, therefore your conditions are your property. You own the place of the exteriorization, therefore that's your property too. Only at the moment of exteriorization, to be clear. Custody of other beings. So this one's very important, like extremely important. The triune self has custody over its human being. So it looks like we've got a little rendering error here, but these last 3 points are under number 3. The triune self is a creature of intelligence, while the human being is a creature of nature. And so the universe is divided into an intelligent side and a nature side. The triune self and the human being are separate beings. You are not your body. you are the intelligent incorporeal entity inhabiting your body, and it is a property relation between you and your body, and that relation can be trespassed upon. And this statement says it's illegal to trespass upon it because we recognize it as your property. The Triune Self and the human being are paired together during incarnation. As a result of incarnation, the human being becomes the property of its Triune Self. The Triune Self has custody over its human being, and the Triune Self has a duty to care for its human being. There you go. So custody and property, but you're also separate beings. That human being, the animal part of it, it's got its own consciousness in its own right, and it's following the law of thought in its own progression. It's not as advanced as you are, not yet, but it will one day become a Triune Self in its own right, as it evolves. But right now, you're paired together with it. Now we get on to recognizing the ownership over thoughts. Or rather, we recognized ownership over thoughts. Now we're going to say, okay, you own it. There's a property relation between you and your thoughts. So 1531, property relations concerning thoughts. Property relation of a thought with itself. This is the identity relation again. By virtue of 1431a, ownership of a thought in itself, a property relation exists between a thought and itself. The thought owns itself. Why? Because it is a being in its own right and does act autonomously insofar as its development and what it's conscious of. In Percival's language, we might say it's conscious as that thought and its aim and its function, but not conscious of itself as a thought. It's not that developed yet. But it's still its own being, and therefore it's got an identity a little bit, and therefore it has a property relation with itself because it owns itself. Property relations of triune selves with thoughts. So this can get confusing. So 1532a, bidirectional property relation for triune selves and their thoughts. By virtue of 1432b, joint ownership of a thought with a triune self, a bidirectional property relation exists for each thought a triune self owns. And here's what we mean by bidirectional property relation. It's a relation in two directions. The thought is the property of the Triune Self for the purpose of the Triune Self's growth and destiny. If you issue a thought into reality, you own that thought. It's your property. It's going to serve you for the purpose of your growth and development. But it goes the other way as well. The Triune Self is the property of the thought for the purpose of the thought's growth. But because a piece of you goes into that thought to be bound into its processes by nature, that means the thought also has some level of control over you. And that means it's a property relation because control works with ownership. And this is a partial situation in this case, but that means the thought, because it's able to set your destiny, that thought can control you to that degree insofar as its aim is concerned. And so you and all other triune selves that are attached to that thought become the property of that particular thought. And again, that's the mass attachment scenario. And a way to think about that is religions and their worshippers. The worshippers are each of the beings that are attached to that thought, and the thought owns all of them. It wants more worshippers so that it can get stronger and stronger and stronger. There is a dynamic there as well. One-to-many property relation when a thought is shared with multiple triune selves. Right, we were just saying this. By virtue of 1432c, joint ownership may be shared with other triune selves. The same thought controls multiple bidirectional property relations with each involved triune self. And I just gave the example of the religion with the worshippers. The more triune selves that participate, the stronger and more powerful will be the thought. So that's something to be careful of because it means that as a thought gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it becomes a kind of God in nature, like a little God, but it becomes like very big and powerful and a force to be reckoned with. So it's something to be careful of. The big powerful thoughts often because they are unconscious aims in nature and they don't know right from wrong, they don't act that way. They can create a world environment that isn't very good or pleasant to be in. That's the risk. And number two, the thought exteriorizes along its aim, affecting all triune selves bound to it. So that's one to many. Not conscious control, and it's a warning. The thought does not consciously control the relation nor the attached triune selves. It can only direct in a linear way along its aim in accordance with the law of thought. They are conscious as their functions only, not conscious of their function. It is for this reason that certain thoughts may require guidance or regulatory pathways to safely manage their exteriorizations. For example, the thoughts that are for profit enterprises. Because if you don't, you get fascism. That's why. Here's a famous quote from Carl Jung: thoughts have people. People don't have ideas. Ideas have people. That's a little quote that says this. Here, here. Okay, and here's another tip or hint or way of thinking about thoughts. They have a charge and discharge dynamic. As more triune cells attach to the same thought, it can be thought of as a charge building in the atmospheres. And this is along the same lines of thinking as electric universe theory. When a mass exteriorization occurs, it can be thought of as a discharge of that energy. Concepts or patterns of charge and discharge can apply to thoughts. And one situation where this can be a problem socially is if you have a polarization, a great polarization of the people. Everybody's on the right of politics, and then everybody else is on the left of politics, and they get more and more extreme in their polarizations. Well, the more extreme they get, the further apart they get, that's a charge building in the society, the thought of the society, and it's going to discharge. How would a situation like that discharge? Through a civil war. They go fight it out, a bunch of them die, and then the thought, they realize, what have we done after the fact? And then the thought loses its power, but not before a civil war occurs. A big societal thought, when it is extremely polarized, can cause a civil war in the society. And that's dangerous to the society. And so that's a situation to be aware of, and we want to make sure we can avoid it. Okay, next one. 154, thoughts and their exteriorizations. So now we're looking at exteriorizations and recognizing how thoughts exteriorize and the relations involved with exteriorizations. So 1541A, thought hierarchy. Thoughts can form a hierarchy. Example, one thought might be a country. Another set of thoughts might be cities within that country. A third set of thoughts might be houses within each city. 131, the free will universe, is an example of a thought hierarchy because every dimension listed there is a thought in its own right. The entire universe is constructed of thoughts, it's a whole mental thing. So it's possible for thoughts to arrange themselves in a hierarchy, and that's a kind of construct. If thoughts can arrange themselves in a hierarchy mentally, then when they exteriorize, the physical exteriorization might also form a hierarchy. So we have 1541b, exteriorization hierarchy. As thoughts always exteriorize, their exteriorizations also form a hierarchy. That's recognized by the Genesis Codex. The exteriorization hierarchy mirrors the thought hierarchy. They are the same hierarchy. And the same example above is also an exteriorization hierarchy. So for example, in this one, you could not have a city owned by the country that exists outside the boundaries of the country. Logically, that won't make sense. If the country owns a city outside the boundaries, let's say they're in another country, then that city actually still belongs to the territory of the country. So it will still be under the country, logically, even if it's within the borders of another country. It's kind of like a city state, but joined with a larger country. 1541C. Host thoughts provide realm and laws. Thoughts higher up in hierarchy provide a realm in which lower thoughts can exteriorize. The rules that determine how the higher thought exteriorizes become the immutable laws in which the lower thought exteriorizes. We're going to go over this point a bit later. If you're outside of reality, you're just playing with rules, and you can change the rules however you need. But if you're inside the reality, you cannot change those rules, and those rules, in fact, are the laws of the reality. And so that dynamic is expressed here. And so this whole part, 1541C, is saying the parent thought in a hierarchy is the one that sets the laws for the child thought. And 1541D, sibling thoughts are independent of each other. Thoughts that exteriorize at the same level in the hierarchy are independent and have no abilities to set laws for each other. They may share the same context, however. And then we get into whatever our context is. And they're independent. So if you take like a series of events that unfold in reality one after the other, they all occur in sequence. Let's say they're sibling thoughts. Because of the time of exteriorization, the sequence of exteriorization is going to be one after the other, after the other, after the other. But this is just queued up in nature for, let's say, rendering or exteriorization, but they're all independent. These thoughts weren't necessarily related to each other. They just happened to exteriorize in that particular sequence. If they were to exteriorize again, it might be a different sequence. So we say that those thoughts are siblings to each other and they don't set each other's laws. So going back to our cities and countries example, you could have a city in country A set the laws for city A and a city B in country B in a completely different territory, still on the same planet, however. So they share the parent thought of planet Earth, but they're on different continents. And city B sets the laws for city B, city A sets the laws for city A. They both exteriorize, they're exteriorizing all kinds of things at the same time in their location, but they're independent of each other. But they're both cities under countries on continents on Earth. So the ultimate parent in the hierarchy is Earth. Then we have independent hierarchies, continent, country, city. And so they're sibling at the sibling levels to each other in that kind of hierarchy, and therefore they're independent. So this is an abstract way of looking at thoughts, which is important because that gets into things like legal entities are thoughts, and therefore they follow the law of thought. And so we're pointing out relations here and behavior with respect to thoughts, which will, because thoughts are the underlying unit in nature, everything that stems from thoughts also applies to these laws. Legal entities are a kind of thought. These laws apply to them. Countries are a kind of thought. These laws apply to them. Religions are a kind of thought. These laws apply to them. And the Genesis Codex recognizes that, and this section is all about establishing the recognition. Okay, contextual exteriorizations. We're saying that exteriorizations have a context. Okay, so what is the context? By virtue of 134 exteriorization, the context includes at least the relevant thoughts, objects, actions, and/or events, times, conditions, and places, any and all human bodies involved, the knowledge sets of the Triune Selves involved at the moment of exteriorization, and the position in an exteriorization hierarchy. All of this comes into play at the moment of exteriorization. the context. There might be multiple thoughts exteriorizing at the same time with the same objects, actions, and events, with the same times, conditions, and places, even with the same bodies. But the Triune Selves participating will have different knowledge sets when that occurs, and they may even be at different positions in the hierarchy. And therefore, the context is not the same thing as what's involved in exteriorization. It includes the knowledge, it includes what they know. Exteriorizations are contextual. So, why is this important? Study of things like morality and right and wrong, we don't do a relative or absolute thing. Our definition and laws around morality are absolute, but it's not relative, it's not subjective, and it's not absolute. It's absolute contextual. And that's a different thing than the other three. Absolute contextual is not the same as absolute, it's not the same as subjective, and it's not the same as relative. The function of absolute contextual is it's based on your development and knowledge at that point, at that moment of exteriorization, the context. And so you can't say, for example, what would a reasonable person do in that particular time? Because of two things. One, what even is a reasonable person when most people on the planet are insane? And to further add to that, if they aren't also in touch with their rightness mind, reason and rightness are linked one to one. So you can't have reasonable without also having rightness in play. And furthermore, since most of them are citizens, they are subjects and aren't in control of themselves. They don't own their own property. They're not free. They're children, wards of the state. Why do they have any say in the matter anyway? What makes them qualified? And then the other reason, of course, context is it depends on what they know. The idea of a reasonable person isn't who that being is in that moment of time with what they know and what their abilities are. That particular moment in time, that exteriorization, that is there for that being to learn what to do and what not to do. That's why it's occurring under the law of thought. So when you say that, or if you craft a law that interferes with that they can't choose the right course of action in their own judgment, that's actually a trespass and it's injurious to them. It prevents them from growing. So to say that more succinctly, the right action may be illegal and the wrong action may be legal. And that's a problem. The societies can't evolve in that kind of a framework. This idea of context is another way of looking at the problem, another tool to be able to solve it and navigate it and work with it. And this one works with knowledge of the law of thought and therefore does not trespass against that law and also enables people not to trespass against each other. So you can't actually establish absolute laws for everyone because they're all on different stages of growth and they all have to meet their exteriorizations in life according to their ability. You can try and you can set guidelines, but you can't absolutely control their behavior. They have to learn. And that learning is the best way to establish a peaceful society because then they are driven according to what they know and they're driven according to their own experience rather than what some book says or what some politician said. And so we can build a world where people can honor the laws, honor themselves, and honor each other with this kind of understanding. 1542b. Exteriorization context can be shared. Multiple different exteriorizations may share the same context, but they are independent of each other. And so here's just a warning to be careful. One exteriorization can be shared among all Triune Selves involved, and they will all have the same context. This is specifically referring to different exteriorizations occurring simultaneously and thus share some, if not all, of the same context. So this refers to this statement here, 1542b. So there's two kinds of ways in which context can be shared. One, exteriorization amongst all the people involved, That's the same context, aside from the knowledge, of course. It's also possible for multiple exteriorizations to occur in the same time condition and place, and that's going to be different context. Well, they share some, if not all of it. There could be multiple different contexts in play. Okay, so now we get on to the big recognitions. I said the world was insane. Here's why. 155, confusion. Origin of confusion. By virtue 145, the law of forgetting, each triune self forgets the foundation of knowledge it has for itself, and this is the state of forgetfulness. The intuitive channel through which knowledge is gained is clouded, such that only small fractions of knowledge can be obtained. The knowledge of proper thinking procedures is lost, and thus errant thinking occurs. See 1235a, errant thinking, for the definition. So your minds, it's not just one mind, it's like 7 minds in atmospheres. So you got your psychic mind, your objective mind, the body mind, you have your psychic minds, feeling and desire, your mental minds, reason and rightness, and your noetic minds, I-ness and selfness. Each of those minds exists in an atmosphere, and the atmosphere can be clear or it can be cloudy or foggy, and it can be really thick. The thicker the atmosphere is for you, the harder it is for you to work with those minds. And intuition, let's call it a channel from the noetic atmosphere to you. And so if your intuition is very strong, you're able to channel knowledge directly from the atmosphere into your being and work with it. If your intuition is very weak, you won't be able to channel so much. If you're not able to get good knowledge, that's going to be a source of confusion for you. And one of those things is knowledge of proper thinking procedures, the thought process. So people think it's okay to defer all their thinking to an AI system, for example, or a book. But it's not okay. There's huge problems there. You don't train your thinking minds when you do that. And thus confusion occurs. So 1551a, forgetting proper relations. A triune self in a state of forgetfulness will also forget its relations with other triune selves and or their own thoughts, as in they will be completely ignorant of them. So they don't remember what a triune self is, they don't know what thoughts are, not really, they don't know how to work with the thoughts properly. 1551b, unknowingly breaking contracts. A triune self in a state of forgetfulness will unknowingly break agreements and contracts with their thoughts or with other triune selves, and this causes more confusion. There's a footnote indicating this actually is a point raised in Thinking and Destiny. So yeah, they say honor your agreements, sure. And there's a rule out there, pacta sunt servanda, all agreements shall be kept. And some people think they can even enforce agreements. The enforcing, though, is a trespass. You can't really do that. However, if you don't honor your agreements, that is actually injurious. So that's also a problem. A triune self who doesn't have knowledge of honor and peace and why honor agreements is so important, they may choose not to honor them. They may be abusive towards them. They may be unreliable, dishonorable trading partners. And then, okay, well, you do that, then you build up a reputation that other people are going to learn about, and they're not going to want to do business with you. And we can see that in like the international stage right now very well. 1551c, ignoring conscience. A triune self in a state of forgetfulness will ignore its conscience when it intervenes in their thinking, and this causes confusion. And it's another point raised by Percival in Thinking and Destiny. Okay, so they don't know what their conscience is. It either may not be working, or if it is, they don't recognize what it's saying. Or even if they do recognize what it's saying, they don't know why they should listen to it, and so they ignore it and continue on. And then the impacts of that confuse everybody because why did you go and disturb the peace? And then there's just karma after karma after karma. As a thought they issue that ignores their conscience balances itself over and over again until they actually learn, if they learn. And so because of that, we get confusion. A triune self in a state of forgetfulness is said to be confused. And here's what confused is. Without an accurate foundation of knowledge, a triune self cannot understand what is happening in their world. They will not know what to do or what not to do. They will not know who they are or who others are. They are confused. It's the free will universe, but it's also known as the realm of confusion. Why? Because forgetting is a thing, because the matter is so thick that everybody forgets. Therefore, confusion is a primary function of this universe. And so we want to be very careful about navigating confusion so that we don't have a forgetful, confused population because they're going to, in their ignorance, trespass and injure others. They don't know what they're doing, they're confused. And so we go on to the impacts of confusion. As a result of the errant thinking inherent in confusion, there is an increased probability of wrong choices. The probability of making wrong choices is greatly increased. There's a definition for what a wrong choice is. It's anything that basically harms anything else, or choices that are not in agreement with the rightness mind. It's what not to do. There is increased probability of individual and societal harm. The probability that wrong choices cause harm to individuals and cascade to affect all of society is greatly increased. It's a probability game here. Confused people create problems for themselves and for the people around them and for society because they will just go about injuring others and they won't think anything of it. Realm of confusion. The free will universe is also known as the realm of confusion. There you go. And I already said why. And so we want to make sure that we can avoid a confused population, if at all possible, without trespassing against the population. So 1554, the Genesis Safeguard. Every society implementing the Genesis Codex must implement methods to safeguard against confusion developing in its population. Safeguard without harm. Safeguard methods must be instructive or curative. They must not cause harm or damage to a Triune Self or its thought process. So you can't force it. You can't enforce morality because enforcing morality is itself immoral. You can't enforce honor because enforcing honor is itself dishonorable. So it says every society implementing the Codex. This Genesis Codex, like it's starting with Triunia and we're leading the charge on it. But these codices are designed for other societies to adopt as they like. So if you've got a society that you're building and you would like to use this codex and build your society, your own society upon it, you are welcome to do that. This is a gift to humanity. Feel free to use this Genesis Codex and build your own society on top of it. After confusion, we have insanity. And this is the thing that every founder of every society recognizes, the general insanity in the population. And interestingly, in the US Code, the very first definition in their law is that of insane people. Chapter 1, Section 1, Article 1, the very first definition. Insane person, person is non compos mentis, idiot, they all mean the same thing in their law. Why is that definition the very first definition in the entire body of law? Of all the things they could have done first, and we started with preliminaries and definitions and stuff, why did they start with a definition of insane people first? Maybe it tells you something about the state of people in general and the state of societies when they are founded and the state of societies as they still are today because they haven't learned. So 1561, prerequisites for sanity. What does it mean to be sane? It means 1561A, ownership of self. A Triune Self must know and understand 132, a Triune Self, and 142, ownership of self, to truly have ownership over the self. If you don't have ownership over yourself, and if you don't even know what you are, how can you be said to be sane? Right? If you don't know what you are, or you don't own yourself, how can you be said to be sane? If a Triune Self cannot even explain how it is designed nor how it works, how can it prove it is sane? Ignorance and insanity are the recognized defaults in this world of confusion. Lacking self ownership, Triune Selves are easily coerced. So sanity is very much about preserving the operation of your being intact. You can't do that unless you know what you are and how you work, and then have the tools to defend it: self respect, morality, and honor. And so, if you don't have any of those things, the default condition is insanity, because the default condition of reality is confusion and ignorance. Therefore, being sane is the exception to the rule, and thus it's something that has to be proven. 1561b, honor the rightness mind. A triune self must have a correctly working thought process and must honor its rightness mind. A triune self must not ignore their rightness mind. So you have to develop yourself and you have to use your rightness mind, think with it, work with it, and you must not ignore it. You must honor it. And that goes hand in hand with ownership of self in the prerequisites for sanity. It's not enough to simply know what you are and defend how you work and own yourself. You also have to work yourself or run yourself the proper way. 1561c, mitigation of harm. A triune self must not harm their self, nor allow harm to come to them from others. And so we have the character triad for mitigation of harm: self-respect, morality, and honor. Harm results from errant thinking and ignoring the rightness mind. A triune self cannot be said to be sane if it is using its minds improperly. You got to use your minds properly. Got to know what they are, be aware of what they are, work with them, and work with them properly. And then competence with the law of thought. A triune self must know and use one for one the law of thought competently in their daily life. And this is important. So we got a note here. We'll read that first and I'll give additional explanation. Competent use of the law of thought means understanding how thoughts work at a level beyond mere agreements and contracts, and using that knowledge respectfully, morally, and honorably in daily conduct. I specifically write that because I could use my knowledge of the law of thought for evil purposes if I wanted to. I don't. And so it's written here because respectfully, morally, honorably is important. If you were to use them for evil purposes, that falls under you don't really ultimately know what you're doing and are therefore insane. Among such aspects of the law of thought that must be known and understood are balance, attachments, context, exteriorizations, and building a knowledge set consisting of what to do and what not to do for each thought. Lacking this knowledge, a triune self will be led around by a ruling thought, such as a religion, the state, science, or other such belief, and this is not competent use of the law of thought. Knowledge of the law of thought is now entering the world, and we're building a society that embraces this law in its foundational frameworks. And we are further moving towards an information first world through all this extra knowledge stuff on the internet with AI, with computers and stuff. And of course, we've got information first theory of the universe. We are going to do science, a lot of knowledge out of this universe. It's to the point that ignorance of the law of thought is going to be a maladaptive trait. And so if you're maladaptive, that means you're not fit for the environment. And that's a problem for you. Competent use of the law of thought is recognized as a key trait of what makes somebody sane. The prerequisites for sanity are ownership of self, honor the rightness mind, mitigation of harm, and competence with the law of thought. If you can't prove at least all four of those things and also know what you are and how you work, you can't adhere to this test of sanity. And therefore, we get the origins of insanity. By virtue of 145, the law of forgetting, 1551, origin of confusion, and 1552, impact of confusion, it is not possible for a triune self in a state of forgetfulness and confusion to satisfy 1561 prerequisites for sanity. The insane triune self will not know itself and therefore cannot own itself. The insane triune self will disregard its rightness mind and cause harm to itself and others. The insane triune self will consistently and repeatedly make wrong choices that harm itself, others, and society as a whole. the insane Triune Self will neither know nor practice self-respect, morality, nor honor, nor competent use of the law of thought. If the state of forgetfulness is too much and the state of confusion is too much, it will not be possible to satisfy the prerequisites for sanity. Therefore, you will be considered insane. And it all results from a lack of knowledge, because the knowledge informs what you do. So if you don't have the knowledge to be sane, you cannot act sane, because you just fundamentally don't know what you are doing. You have to learn. And so we have other ways people can be insane as well. Insane by definition. Any Triune Self that fails to satisfy 1561 prerequisites for sanity shall be considered or deemed insane. This does not apply while the Triune Self is growing and learning the prerequisites for sanity or reaches a designated age or milestone, whichever comes first. And this is left up to the society to implement and figure out however it sees fit. So, persons non compos mentis. The definition for insane also includes idiot, retard, mentally disabled, person non compos mentis, ward of the state, a human being without a Triune Self, which is an animal human being in ignorance of its Triune Self, a Triune Self that is ignorant of itself, Triune Self that knows itself but willfully chooses actions inconsistent with the prerequisites for sanity. In other words, an evil Triune Self. Self-governance. Self-governance is a critical cornerstone of sanity, freedom, democracy, growth, adaptation, and evolution. Whereas development is lacking, as in the case of a ward of the state, no matter their age, that being cannot be considered sane because they fail to satisfy their prerequisites for sanity. A ward of the state may not appear insane at first glance, but technically they are because they aren't operating with self-governance. They don't own themselves, therefore they can't satisfy their prerequisites for sanity. Insane by confusion. Any Triune Self that exteriorizes consistent and repeated actions of 1551D confusion, and especially where such actions result in harm or damage to self, others, or society, shall be considered or deemed insane. So Triune Self goes around hurting everybody or things, they're considered insane. This will be caught by the definition as well, but it's also restated here more explicitly. But what if it's a state of war? So there's an exception for war acts. Deliberate acts of harm or damage done as part of a rebellion, insurrection, protest, civil disobedience, civil war, international war, espionage, or as part of any other grand political strategy where the acts are morally defensible shall not be grounds upon which an insanity declaration can be based. Such actors must still satisfy prerequisites for sanity. So as long as this holds true, harm and damage can be done if it's like a political protest or a war or something, as long as the Triune Self is otherwise sane according to our definitions. And I was thinking about a crime exception, but I'm not sure about this. But here it is. Insane Triune Selves commit crimes, but crimes may not be used as the sole justification for deeming a Triune Self insane. The Triune Self must be tested against 1561 prerequisites for sanity and must fail that test to be deemed insane. So we've got deemed insane and considered or deemed insane. We do not want to have a society where it's so rigid in its rules that if you don't follow them, you're considered insane automatically by default, or based on what you do, you're considered insane. And you especially don't want the society to get classism in there based on the sanity or insanity of a population. We don't want criminals automatically being considered insane. We don't want people who are learning and developing to automatically be considered insane. And we don't want insane actions to have legal consequences on your life throughout the society. It's not a crime to be insane. It's just a function of the reality in which you exist, and you have to learn and grow yourself out of it. And so it's not illegal, it's not a crime to be insane. And therefore, making a mistake can't be used as grounds to consider you insane, and also can't be used as grounds to arrest you or throw you in jail or whatever, or make your life miserable or punish you. They can't treat you that way just because you're insane and made a mistake in insanity. At the same time, though, yeah, so we say it down here. It's not a defense. And we'll get to that. We'll go back to that. Society can't punish you for insanity, but it's also not a good defense. And so let's get to that just after this one. 1562C, insane by thinking errors. Any triune self that exteriorizes actions consistent with errant thinking shall be considered or deemed confused. So that's errant thinking. Should their errant thinking lead to consistent harm or damage to self, others, or society, then they shall be considered or deemed insane. So that's abusive thinking. So errant and abusive, and the difference is the harm and the damage. And there's also a consistency thing there. So if you keep doing it, you're confused, and if you keep doing it severely, you're insane. Okay, 1563, no penalty for insanity. No penalty nor punishment shall be imposed against a triune self following it being considered or deemed insane. Okay, so that clearly says what I was trying to say earlier. The society cannot punish somebody just because it thinks they're insane. Misconfiguration. Insanity is a misconfiguration of being that can only be fixed through the learning and development of the triune self. It is not a crime to be insane. Insanity is the default condition of humanity at this time due to widespread ignorance. Okay? At the same time, though, there's no defense for insanity. We don't recognize them. Insanity cannot be used as an excuse or a defense when a crime has been committed. Other societies recognize insanity as some kind of excuse for committing a crime. We don't. You have to own your actions and take responsibility for them, even if you are insane, because that's how you grow. No defense for lack of self control. Lack of self control cannot be used as an excuse or a defense when a crime has been committed. Here's why. Any lack of self control ultimately means failing 1561A, ownership of self, and thus failing the prerequisites for sanity. Lack of self control for any reason is an issue of insanity and thus cannot be used as an excuse for the choice to commit a crime directly or the choice to surrender control and thus commit a crime directly or indirectly. This goes back to the law of free will. You always have a choice to set your desire however you want. And so we honor that law, and thus we do not recognize lack of self control or other insanity defenses as legitimate defenses when a crime has been committed. You have to own your actions. Examples of this: impulsive behavior, listening to voices or being possessed, following blackmail instructions because this compromises your operation of your being remotely controlled by a computer, under the influence of drugs and/or other intoxicants, under the influence of any sensation from nature. There is no excuse for insanity. These are all influences from nature in one form or another, and you have to learn not to succumb to them. You are the master of nature, of yourself, and then when you've done that, nature respects you and you become a master of nature. Otherwise, it's the other way around. Nature will own you and you'll be run around like a monkey. Insane. And the Genesis safeguard for insanity. Every society implementing the Genesis Codex must implement methods to safeguard against insanity developing in its population. And again, it must be without harm. The safeguard methods must be instructive or curative. They must not cause harm or damage to a triune self or its thought process. Safeguard into sanity. Safeguard methods must produce a population that satisfies their prerequisites for sanity. If it doesn't do that, it's not a safeguard method. And so, as a tip for how to do that, I would suggest identify a standard set of thoughts that create a knowledge set to satisfy the prerequisites for sanity and teach them along with their respective laws. Or said another simpler way, give them a basic education that actually makes sense. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you found it interesting and inspiring. There is a solution to tyranny. This is it. Your best thinking brought you here. The system's purpose is what it does. It's time for better thinking and a better system. In this video, we looked at our first set of recognitions: being, property of self and thought, the relations between thoughts and their exteriorizations, and how it interacts with law, confusion, and insanity. These are the most important foundational recognitions in the Codex. They provide greater awareness of ourselves, how we ought to relate to each other from a legal standpoint, and our actual position in the universe at this time. To summarize, we are each Triune Selves inhabiting a human body so we may learn and grow. The sanctity of our being must be kept intact. We own ourselves, our bodies, and our bodies are in our custody, not the state's. We own our thoughts, and this implies we also own our exteriorizations, be they objects, actions, or events. Exteriorizations have a context, and that context determines jurisdiction. Confusion is a natural consequence of existing in this universe as a result of the law of forgetting. Confusion can be a problem, so we want to try to avoid it if we can. When confusion becomes extreme, it progresses to insanity. Insane people harm themselves and others and have not developed themselves sufficiently to meet a baseline healthy standard. The society should take great care, without force, to prevent insanity from developing where it can. In the next video, we will focus on trespass, which is what confused and insane people end up doing with their time. Trespasses are harms and are a lot more nuanced than is typically understood. It's a big topic, and we'll get a dedicated video to it. It should be posted in a week or two, but there is no regular posting schedule, so subscribe to be notified in case you're interested. Thank you for watching. I'll see you there.